Hello, my name is Jerry Holmes, and this is the fourth academic presentation on the topic of human development in children. As I began this research, I was looking for aspects of human development that really matter. Human development research goes back to the 1950s and then really took off in the 1980s, and I was curious to know that since then, what has changed in our understanding of human development, and more importantly, what is essential to know? What matters most as we instruct and nurture young families in the raising of children? Two things I noticed. One is that there is an increasing understanding of socialization, of the importance of the family, of building a strong connection to caregivers in the early stages of life. And second, that human development is very complex. Truthfully, it seems almost miraculous that a child should mature with healthy functionality or emerge into adulthood unscathed. But the reality is that many children don't. I think we need to rest the idea that we can raise a child perfectly and protect them and guarantee that they have a safe and perfect life so that they become perfectly healthy adults. That's a myth. Psalm 51, verse 5 in the King James Version says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." Simply put, David said he was born in sin and shaped in iniquity. This is true of him, and this is true of us. No matter how spiritual or careful we attempt to be, sin is present in the heart of every child and in the lineage of every family. Sin is in the culture, in the community, in the family, and dare I say it, in the church. We're all affected by sin. Sin interrupts human development. It affects everyone, cognitively or in the way we think, emotionally in the way we manage our feelings, socially in how we are affected by others, and morally or spiritually in how we do or don't turn to God for help and support. So on that foundation, we want to launch this topic. What matters most in helping a child recover, rebound, or become whole again after trauma? Assuming the child will be affected, harmed, or disadvantaged in some way. To answer that question, what matters most, we're going to look at the research related to how a child copes when under pressure, when they experience difficult circumstances, trauma, victimization, or trouble. It's as if human development is tested in the face of hardship. And in the face of hardship, we see what researchers call resiliency. In this presentation, we are going to look at the following. What are the common offenses that affect children? These are called ACEs, or Adverse Childhood Experiences. And what factors make these more or less severe? Then we're going to look at identifying when a child is distressed. We will look at how can we ascertain the level of their distress in order to assist them in their recovery. And third, we're going to define resilience, what we're hoping for, what are the indicators of positive recovery after an ACE. And fourth, we're going to unpack the most common factors that help a child be resilient or help a child recover and become resilient. And this is the main body of this presentation. Do children face hardship? A 20-year-old study that concluded in 1998 and included over 17,000 participants explored childhood trauma and abuse and its link to adult mental health. A shocking discovery in the study was noted that most American children had experienced some form of child abuse, neglect, or unusually stressful or traumatic rearing conditions, or ACEs, adverse child experiences. In fact, the average person had experienced anywhere from 3 to 5 of these particular categories. The research indicated that there were 3 categories, including abuse, neglect, and household functioning, and itemized them in 10 ways. I want to take a few minutes to go over to them so we can understand what kinds of hardship or trauma children may experience in your care, in your church, or in your community. First of all, there's physical abuse. Now, I want to be clear what physical abuse is not. Physical abuse is not the same as spanking. If the hand is well placed on the butt or the thigh, if the hand is intended to sting, to draw attention to a child's behavior, if the person is not angry at the point of scaring the child so the child fears for their life, and if no bruises or marks are left, personally, I do not qualify this as abuse, although some may differ in their opinion. Physical abuse is causing physical harm to a child by hitting, kicking, punching, scratching, beating, burning, throwing, or stabbing. It results in injuries like bruises, cuts, or fractured or broken bones. And it obviously creates a great deal of pain, fear, and distress. Then there's sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is engaging in any sexual behavior with a child to exploit the child. Okay, this is not when a child is lovingly bathed by the parent, or a person walks into a room where a child is naked, or when a caregiver has to view a child who has some genital sickness or health issue. It is when one uses the child's nakedness or sexual vulnerability to satisfy or profit personal desires. So this is engaging in any sexual behavior with a child, exploitation of a child, exposing oneself indecently to a child, or exposing the child to pornography. It also would include child prostitution or use of a child in pornography. Verbal abuse. This is using the voice and words to scream, yell, curse, assault, or manipulate a child. It usually involves shaming. How could you do such a thing? What's wrong with your head? What kind of idiot are you? And it usually involves anger, volume, or intimidation. Then there is the category of neglect. There's physical neglect. This is failing to provide for a child's basic needs. This is literally allowing a baby to cry who's hungry or is in distress because their diaper is wet. It is not providing food, water, or shelter for a child. So the child is too cold, not properly dressed. It could be failing to provide medical care for a child who is sick or suffering in some way. Not keeping a child clean, so they're very uncomfortable, smell, and are not properly supervised. It could involve withholding food as punishment for long periods or due to poverty and not addressing a child's cry for more. Then there's emotional neglect. This is kind of the hardest one to identify, but this is behaving in such a way that causes the child emotional harm and interferes with their healthy mental growth. So, exposing them to frightening things on purpose, and then not comforting them or mocking them when they're afraid. Leaving a child alone, unprotected for long periods of time, usually incites a lot of anxiety. Expecting a child to perform tasks that, on their own, that they are not developmentally able to handle. They don't know how to do them. They've had no instruction or modeling. It can include ridiculing them, blaming them, threatening them, isolating, or rejecting them, or shaming them publicly. Household dysfunction is the last of these three categories, and it includes 5 different things. The first one is mental illness. This is when a household family member has some kind of a mental illness that makes it not possible to properly care for the child, and it has a profound effect on the child. It could include severe mood swings. It could include continual bouts of depression that put the mom or dad in bed, and they're unavailable and they're excessively sleeping. It could include acting out angrily and then flipping into obsessive coddling or cuddling. Security and safety are key elements in raising children. So anytime there's a family dysfunction that disrupts child's routines, there's no routines or rhythms, and the child starts to feel like they're living life guarded or wary of what's coming next or around the corner, this might constitute mental illness for the child abuse. Witnessing abuse is kind of different than experiencing abuse because it has a different kind of trauma. Children are naturally more attached to their mothers at birth and therefore more protective of their distress or pain. So watching a mother being beaten, verbally abused, frightened, may make the child feel very helpless, that they can't intervene and feel responsible for what's happening. Then there's loss. Loss can be because of divorce or separation. So when an important figure is removed from the child's life, and they have the ability to come back, they have the ability to engage, but they don't, the child may experience that as abandonment and distress and personally wonder why they weren't good enough, they didn't matter enough, their parents didn't love them enough to stay and want to be with them. The final category is imprisonment or incarceration. So the child may again feel that sense of loss for the parent leaving them, but they may have also modeled some inappropriate behaviors before they left. There may have been policemen at the door. It may have been difficult when the parent was arrested. And if they're taken to see their parent in prison, this might be awkward and uncomfortable for the child. There is, of course, another aspect to this and substance abuse that we often don't think about, and that is there's public shame and humiliation around incarceration and when a parent has a substance problem or a mental health issue. Children often want to hide their family dysfunction from their friends and community, which causes them to socially self-isolate, not have friends over, not want to talk about their family or have their family show up for school events or other events. This in itself can have a negative effect on the child. And of course, there is substance abuse. If a parent is addicted to a substance, uses a lot of drugs, is drunk or inebriated, it may cause a lot of severe changes in behavior, making the caregiver very unpredictable, making the child confused about changes in behavior. Trauma can also occur outside of these categories, and you'll see a little bit of that on the left in a list. So there is no real complete list, but researchers have included things like bullying, racism, community violence, natural disasters, of course, situation where a child is a refugee or experiencing war, acts of terrorism, homelessness, or acute poverty. Now, this is quite an extensive list, and I hope you understand that it's true when I say that most human beings, most Americans, will experience anywhere from 3 to 5 of these in their life. One comment I want to make in this slide is that the event itself isn't predictive about how much trauma it will cause. 2 children can experience sexual abuse and not have the same symptoms or the same affect. That's because there are other elements to be considered. First of all, how long was the exposure and how close was the child to the event? What age were they and what developmental stage were they at? Also, the child's unique response. We have personality and DNA aspects. A shy child who's highly sensitive may be much more frightened and impacted by things than a child who's very strong-willed and confident and outgoing. So we need to consider these things as we look at the problem of abuse or all of these different ACEs and how they happen. What we want to go on to talk about is how we overcome, survive, and regain our equilibrium after hardship or after having experienced an ACE. What is remarkable is that researchers have found that at least 50% and even closer to 70% of children in high-risk environments grow up to not only be successful by societal indicators, but be confident, competent, and caring persons. So, of course, there is the 30 to 50% that don't, that struggle, and we certainly want to be there for these children. But we do want to not feel like it's a given that children can't bounce back and appear confident and competent and be resilient after a negative event. We may call the factors that help a child overcome problems as protective factors or their ability to cope well. And we're going to speak more of this later. So let's look together at identifying and helping the distressed child. One of the first indications that a child has experienced trauma is we see a personality change. A child who may be particularly outgoing, bubbly, happy, carefree is suddenly now looking remote, withdrawn, wants to isolate himself, seems very anxious. Or you may notice a child who is naturally shy, cooperative, compliant, easygoing, never rocks the boat, now is having stubborn little temper fits over funny little things. When a child's personality changes, take note. Second, a child's play or coping seems inconsistent with what's happening. Maybe they're building a little Lego tower and it collapses, and they break into great amounts of tears and distress, and they could hardly be settled or comforted, and it just doesn't seem to be characteristic with other experiences in their life. The child regresses developmentally. This is very common, especially in the first few grades of school, where a child will suddenly start wetting themselves or wetting the bed, and they have no history of this before. Or they may start sucking their thumb or rolling their hair, twisting with their nervous little tics and habits. Or they may want their teddies or their stuffies, and they don't want to leave their house without certain things. Now, again, some of these things are normal, but when it suddenly starts to happen and it didn't happen before, we take note. Fourthly, they can demonstrate a cluster of symptoms known as PTSD. And I want to make note immediately that any one of these things could be normal childhood behaviors. But when we're starting to see a whole bunch of them, then we might want to sit up and say, is this post-traumatic stress? So some of them might include nightmares, flashbacks. They may have reactions to the anniversary, for instance, of the death of their grandma, or a reminder of a place they visited. Maybe something happened in the mall where a stranger tried to grab them and they never want to go to the mall again. They may be avoiding people that they didn't seem to mind with being with before. They may be avoiding situations, generally just wanting to stay closer to a parent and not venture out. So we're seeing a lot of anxiety going on. We see them kind of acting numb, flat. We don't see those the whole flux of emotion that children demonstrate, or we see a lot of emotion, like almost too much emotion all the time. We see them very easily aroused. The smallest little thing makes them irritable. They are very reactionary. Again, all of this is new, something we didn't experience before. There can be physical responses of sickness and colds, stomach aches, and usually the thing to note is all of these symptoms will last longer than a month and may keep reoccurring. One of the things we may ask ourselves is, why do we do what we do after a traumatic event? Why do some children respond and some children don't respond? Well, to find the answer to that question, we would look at the Bible. Genesis 1:26 says, "And God said, let us make man in our own image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion." This assignment of dominion can be translated in our language to control. Every human being, child or adult, has an innate desire to feel in control of the environment around them. They like to know what's expected of them so they can make choices to fulfill those expectations or not. But because of our desire or need to have dominion or control, human beings very much resist powerlessness. Many times, children have been wounded because of others' need to express personal power and control over them. But a child needs to embrace a new sense of self, not a victim, but of a survivor. They need to gain some measure of control. It is quite surprising how inventive and creative we are at surviving. Sometimes people disassociate. They go to another world, another imagination or fantasy when things are happening. Sometimes they assess the situation and decide to take charge, to be very quiet, to avoid people, to please people, or to be especially good. Sometimes children fight back, literally or inwardly. This is the human spirit wanting to find something to do to cope with trauma. This is not all bad. We are survivors. And yet helping a child recover from trauma, or anything else for that matter, is helping them see these powerful choices and how they're trying to protect themselves. We look at Genesis 3:7, we see, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves apron. It is the human condition to want to self-protect. And so to help these children, we must give them a sense of personal autonomy, help them understand what they do have control over and how they self-protect. While it may have helped them when they were young to survive and get through life, quite frequently at some point in our lives, we must address these memories, address these traumas, and address the fact that we have self-protective strategies. So first, I want to take a moment to define the word resilience, because I do use it frequently and have already used it in this presentation. I'm going to borrow from the American Psychological Association's definition, and they say it's the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. So you can see in the pictures 2 children who are distressed, and on the right side we see them having adjusted to the world around them and found themselves exploring, comfortable, and moving on again. This is our goal. If we broke this goal down, according to the American Psychological Association, we would see a list of behaviors that indicate resilience. First of all, number 1, we can make connections. We reach out to other people, we ask for help, we tell somebody about what happens, we draw into our family, into our friends, or into our community. So it's no longer a secret that we hold deep inside ourselves. Number 2, we're able to look at that experience with a realistic appraisal of its effects on us, and yet believe that we can overcome our struggles. It's not insurmountable. Of course, to do that, we've got to talk about it. Third, we accept the fact that we have to change, that hard times, traumatic events change us, and we have to be able to flex with that change and move on to find a new normal that could even be better than the old. Fourth, we move ourselves forwards towards a goal and a future. We think ahead, we look ahead to tomorrow, to the next day, to the next school grade, to the next visit with family. We have hope for the future. And with that in mind, number 5, we take action steps. We don't let what we have experienced shut us down, stop us from making better choices. 6, we start to get a sense of ourselves. We see our reactions, our weaknesses, our struggles, and we look for what we can learn, gain, or grow from what we've experienced. And finally, 7, we see ourselves capable, able to overcome. We have what it takes. And 8, we have a good perspective. Life is not bad. Life is not all horrible and frightening and scary, but it can be more. We don't catastrophize, but we keep things in perspective. We're going to dig in a little farther into the research on resilience, and I have narrowed the research that I found to my own list of 5 particular things that indicate resilience. The first on my list is the family. The family unit is a key in impacting the level of trauma a child experiences, in assisting or hindering the recovery of a child from trauma. A study of 128 street children revealed that traumas caused by human factors have a greater negative impact than traumas caused by nature or climate. Interfamily abuse had much lower resiliency scores, in other words, children did not do well, as did those on the street due to economic problems. Also, children who had not experienced previous relational traumas had higher coping capabilities. Good past relationships were a protective factor on the streets. Combined with other studies, they concluded that children living in the streets for economic reasons presented a lower prevalence of symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, and depression than those that were in the street as a result of psychological or physical abuse within the family, in adoptive families, or in children's homes. So if we look to the left, it says trauma caused by the family has a powerful effect on the child. Yet in similar way, family support is very significant in emergent outcomes or overcoming trauma. When we look at what it means for family and what it means to be a strong family unit, we see on the right some of its characteristics. A strong family unit is a nurturing parent-child relationship. It is a stable living situation. It is a consistent and constructive parental discipline style. It's a secure attachment, and we did discuss that in our last academic presentation. It's a place to go for comfort, to return to when exploring. It has other positive relationships that act as substitutes, like grandparents, cousins, aunties, uncles. And a family participates together in home activities or has a strong social group that they all belong to. So caring individuals reach in to connect and can break the isolation, drawing them out and away from the isolation to a safe place or safe community then. Helping a child gain resilience then is assisting them in finding a person or persons who can constitute family, who they can attach to, and that need never goes away. This is so important to remember that research has showed that the one most important thing in a child's ability to be resilient is that there is one supportive adult who is consistently present in their life. To all of you leaders and church leaders in the room, never assume because a child attends your church they're supportive. Never assume that they cannot be traumatized at home. If you see signs of trauma, as illustrated already, reach out to the child. Find the brat and befriend them. Find the shy child and gently encourage them. Be that one person who reaches for connection. Don't judge them. You don't know what really is going on at home. Assume that they're rebellious and stupid for a reason. And self-pity is a way of coping and trying to get the help they need. Don't be afraid to ask and question what is really going on here. The second main thing we need to overcome hardship, whether a child or an adult, is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the individual's belief in their own capacity to act in ways to reach certain goals. And what helps a child do this? First of all, as we look at this slide, we see its successful past experiences, its knowledge and help to understand what tasks are necessary and how to set them in order to achieve them. Also, its trust that others will support me and help me if I need them. And finally, it's the ability to reflect upon my own thoughts and feelings and modify them in order to think more clearly and make better choices. Let me share a story with you about a boy named Jason. Many years ago, I was working as a teacher's aide and I was given a child to take care of. This child was only in grade 3 and came to the school with a file this thick. I didn't have any experience in working with ADHD, but I read everything that I could read, and together him and I were put in an office to work together. He was difficult, and the first week had been very hard. I finally decided that besides reading and learning about him, I should pray, so I spent the week in fasting and prayer, asking God for help. At the end of the week, I received a notice from the school office that his mother wanted to meet me. I went out for coffee with her. While I was out for coffee with her, I found out that he had been the victim of sexual abuse as a child, that his father had a sexual addiction and had exposed him to pornography. I also found out, and his mother admitted to me, that she was an alcoholic. She didn't function much in the morning at all, so she would leave 2 toonies, which is the equivalent of $2, on the counter. He would get his grade 1-year-old brother up. He would dress him and take him to school. They would stop at the vending machine and buy a Coke and a bag of chips, and that was his breakfast. He never had any more food for the rest of the day. When I found that out about him, my heart was deeply moved, and I went back to my classroom with much more compassion. The first thing I did is I decided on some very easy goals to reach. He could only read at a grade 1 level, so we had to start very easy books with very short-term goals. I had a huge reward system, including stickers and check marks and treat boxes and even genuine food to eat. He was only allowed recess time if he accomplished certain goals. It was quite surprising to me how quickly he would respond to the rewards. He was quite surprised that he could even do them, and I could see the pleasure on his face when I put a giant check mark or a star on his paper. But there were still challenging times. One day we'd had a particularly bad day, and he decided that he was angry at what I asked him to do, and he picked up a small school desk and threw it at me. I stepped aside and didn't hurt myself, but I was angry. Everything in me just wanted to grab him and shake him and say something mean. But I cried out to God in the moment for help, and what came out of my mouth surprised me. I said to him, "Jason, you are a leader. When I look at you on the schoolyard, I notice that every kid in the school sees where you are. They notice what you do, and some of them follow. I also know that you've told me after school you have a little group of kids that follow you around, and you get into a lot of trouble. So you're a leader. The question is, what kind of leader do you want to be? You have your whole life ahead of you. Someday you'll grow up and you'll be remembered. You'll be remembered as the Jason who got me in trouble, who got me into hot water, who led me into error. Or you can be remembered as something else. What if you could be remembered as the smart Jason who came up with bright ideas, who made fun for everybody and brought them on adventures? What if you became the good Jason and the good leader?" I said it quite forcibly, and when I was done talking, I looked at him and his eyes were full of tears. And that's the first time I'd ever seen any real emotion on his face. He didn't say anything, and neither did I, but we got back to work, and he was quite cooperative. I learned in that moment how powerful it is that we speak truth into people's lives. We create in children self-efficacy. We have to help them succeed, even by changing the goals to make them achievable and manageable. We have to teach them. We have to come alongside them and help them. And we have to help them see the negative thoughts that keep getting in the way. Some researchers teach children how to identify shots and shoot them down with their gun. Other people talk about putting a flashlight on the thoughts and focusing really hard on them, causing the alarm center to alert them when a thought isn't good. Probably the 2 most powerful beliefs of traumatized children are that the world is not safe for me and I do not have control over my life. But cognitions can change that, not our lectures, not our words, but often by restorative relationships. Number 3 on my list is hope. Maintaining a hopeful outlook and looking for opportunities for self-discovery and growth. Panterbrick and Leckman, two researchers in the field of resilience, conducted systematic face-to-face interviews with over 1,000 youth and adults in refugee families experiencing war in Afghanistan. They concluded that if you could reduce all the resiliency factors into one word, it would be hope. The families that did well believed that their future mattered more than their past. They could get up daily and harness resources to help them secure a better future. This, hanging on to hope, gave them meaning and order to their suffering. They would form a story or narrative that linked the past to the present and their future. They call this hope meaning-making. According to his research, Dr. Stephen Southwick would agree. He said that focusing on what comes after trauma and not the trauma itself is key. This was the belief of Viktor Frankl as well, who believed that it was best to focus on what is left rather than what is lost whenever possible. Frankl was a survival of Nazi concentration camps. He writes in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, that tragic optimism has the human potential to turn suffering and encounters with traumatic events into achievement and accomplishment. We know that this concept of hope is very much supported in Scripture. In Philippians 3:13 and 14, it says, "No, dear brothers and sisters, I have not achieved it, but I focus on this one thing. Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead, I press on." Their future matters more than their past. Jeremiah 29:11 helps us know that we can utilize resources in God and we can secure a better future. Because it says, "For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord. They're plans for good and not for disaster, to give you a future and a hope." Genesis 50:20 tells us that you intended it for harm. Joseph speaking in Genesis 50:20, after what he'd experienced in his captivity and the hurt and trauma he'd experienced from his brothers, said this, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." So it's possible then to find meaning, to believe that trauma and surviving it can make them better. The fourth aspect of resiliency is having self-worth. No matter how many other people suffer hardship or trauma, we all need to be seen as an individual and know we matter. And what we have experienced matters too. Nothing is more destructive than saying to a victim, "Well, everybody's had it bad," or "It could have been worse." We cannot blame a child for having too many feelings or feeling life deeply. We cannot shame people who struggle or seem to have bigger reactions to things. Some children rebound quicker, some take a lot of time, but each person is an individual and needs to be seen as such. As we look at this slide, we find that our pain matters. And God has time for our pain. People around us need to validate our pain and show us that we matter. The most helpful story in the Bible related to trauma is the story of Mary and Martha, who grieve the loss of their brother Lazarus. When Jesus appears after his death, he accompanies Mary to the tomb, and in her grief, Mary wept. And so did Jesus. It makes no sense that he would do so because he could raise Lazarus from the dead in just a few minutes. But Jesus demonstrates not only his compassion, but also his empathetic and comforting presence and response to Mary's present pain. He is with her now. He models for us an important tool for resiliency, that we allow emotions and take care of emotions when hardship happens. There is a pace to resiliency that requires patience. Hebrews 4:15 says, "For we have not a high priest who cannot be touched with the feelings of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." When people experience trauma, they grieve. Grieving is a way of taking care of oneself and is a constant in building resiliency. But not all grief is the same. Some children have minimal losses and others have more. Some children grieve in different ways and at different times. Some don't grieve immediately, some grieve much later. Taking care of oneself also means providing for basic needs. Sometimes during or after a tragic event, basic needs are missing, and they need to be tended to. Does the child have food, shelter, clothing? Are they able to shower, to eat? Do they have problems that need to be addressed? I remember many years ago hearing a story of a young girl whose parents had very, very vicious fights. They would attack each other physically, they would throw things and break things, the house would become very violent. But moving in next door was a young pastor and his wife with a girl the same age. She got to know the girl, and she got to know the family, which were very hospitable to her and welcomed her at any time. When I say any time, I mean any time. They must have understood somehow what was going on because they would allow her to ring the bell, come in, and sleep on the couch. They would feed her on many occasions. In the summer, they would pay for her to go to summer camp. And that is where she found Christ. She eventually went to Bible school and became a strong and courageous Christian. But those people helped her in her trauma. They communicated to her that her feelings mattered and she mattered. The last thing on my list, but certainly not the least important, is what about God? Every Christian asks how God and the church can help build and assist resiliency. The most significant way the church helps build resiliency is by connecting the survivor to a loving God. Now, this is not always as simple as it seems, because unfortunately, many people blame God, even children, for not stopping the perpetrator, the war, or the environmental stressor. When he allowed trauma to happen or failed to intervene, they judged him as unfeeling or uncaring. Some people don't even want to talk about God. Another reason why people do not reach for God is they may have become confused. When spiritual leaders or people they trust, especially those who call themselves Christians, do very evil things. For example, how can a child understand God as righteous and just when their father attends church but sexually abuses them at home? Or how can a child believe in the love of God and the kindness of God when they witness their parents, who are supposed representations of God, yell, scream, swear, and call each other horrible names and act violently? Sometimes children resist talks of God because they've turned their anger and rage on him. Thankfully, he can handle it. But that's why, to help children heal, we cannot avoid the hard conversations. Kilborn believes that to help victims, the church must also understand suffering and be able to be present and present it in simple terms. They must know what God says about their victimization. Romans 8:22 speaks of the whole creation groaning as in the pains of childbirth. No one has felt that more than the traumatized child. Life is hard, life is difficult, and life is very confusing at times. Children need to understand about free will. God may be all-powerful, but he has limited his activities on planet Earth to the will and choices of human beings. To have stepped in to stop things from happening, to stop war or poverty or abuse, would have meant he had to ignore the will of the perpetrator. Children need to understand how important it is that God gives us free will. They also need to understand the nature of evil, that it is evil that drives people's behavior. While there may be wonderful things about the parent they love, or the people they came to trust, or life in general might have been good, evil interferes, evil influences, and many people surrender to evil. Also, children need to understand hardship and suffering. American parents and church leaders are very quick to focus on answers to prayer, God's rescues from lions and the fiery furnace. But we're not so quick to teach Bible stories to children about Paul's persecutions and beatings, about Joseph's pit experiences and imprisonments, or the hardship of being an Ishmael, rejected and abandoned and bullied. Jesus said, "In this world you will have tribulations." What is this, just for adults? Or do children have them as well? We will experience offense, and we will experience trouble. The triumph is not in having faith to avoid or eliminate suffering, or to believe that God will save them from everything that's bad, but in rising above suffering with hope, optimism, and trust in God's strength and power. Some sorrows will not be erased until the last day. Some healing will not entirely take place until then either. And we are told that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. We are also told that God is the God of all comfort. And what is so important is that during or after the events and circumstances that have so deeply affected us, God is ready and willing to comfort us. Sometimes he uses human harms in the name of the people of the church. Sometimes he just meets us in our spirit. This doctrine of suffering needs not to be depressive or negative. Children need to know where suffering comes from and how they will easily believe that they are somehow responsible, not brave enough, strong enough, or too emotional to overcome it. Children need to put their own suffering into words and find their voice to express their feelings and needs, to talk about it and not be given trite answers. And yes, children need to learn how to forgive because Jesus did. But first they need to understand his suffering, his pain, and how real it was for him. They find strength in forgiving as they watch and observe him forgiving his enemies. So how do we summarize all of this? Well, I like what one writer said. We like to live our lives with the idea that nothing bad will happen and everything will be all right. We pass this message on to our children and tell it to ourselves. And yet, according to statistics, the probability of trauma occurring is high. So the question is not, will it happen, but when will it happen? We must look for the strength in each child or individual and focus on it so that there is at least one strong foundation in which to build more resilience. No one expects to have to deal with adversity, but when we expect it, we will deal with it better. So let's review. If we are to help children deal with trauma when it happens and overcome trauma after it happens, we need to be the family they need. If you're a parent, you understand how important all the things we talked about are. But if you're in the family of God, you are a family that many children need. And we have a responsibility to adopt and to take into our arms and into our lives the child who needs the family. We also need to help children believe in themselves and their future, to see their worth, to see their value, and to give them that sense of personal control and autonomy to make good choices and to succeed with them. We need to give them opportunities to excel, to be helpers, to be servers, and to be givers. Next, we need to give them hope and meaning. There is hope for a good future. You are not defined by your past. Your alcoholic parents do not mean you'll have a bad life. There's much more to you than what you have experienced. Finally, we need to support and give them a sense of value and self-worth. We need to bring them to the Word of God so they will hear what God has to say about them. And we need to pull out those strengths and abilities and encourage them to be everything that God has made them to be. Finally, and most importantly, we need to introduce them to Jesus, to the God who cares, who comforts, and who heals, and who has a plan for their life. Thank you for your time.